Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar titled ChangeLab Solutions Comprehensive TRL Model Policy, a step-by-step overview. We are excited that you are all able to join us today. My name is Michelle Sue. I'm a Program Associate here at ChangeLab Solutions. I'll be serving as the moderator and co-presenter for today's webinar along with Jessica Breslin, Staff Attorney at ChangeLab. So I'd like to start out with a few housekeeping announcements. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for download from our website in about a week. And all participant lines have been muted. If you have a question for one of us, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box. They're on the lower left corner of your screen. And we will try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If we run out of time and haven't gotten to your question, we will contact you via email with a response to your question. So first, I'd like to say a few words about ChangeLab Solutions. ChangeLab is a nonprofit based out of Oakland, California. Our mission is to create healthier communities for all through better laws and policies. ChangeLab Solutions has been at the forefront of tobacco control initiatives for over 20 years by providing tailored support to communities as they use the tools of law and policy to regulate where and how tobacco products are marketed, used, and sold. And just a quick disclaimer, the information provided in this webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. ChangeLab Solutions does not enter into attorney-client relationships. And with that, let's get started. So here you'll see the three main topics we will be going over today. We will be giving an overview of tobacco retail licensing, our model ordinance, and enforcement. So what is a tobacco retail license? You may have heard of this license referred to as TRL by local and state jurisdictions. And you may be wondering, aren't there already state tobacco laws in place? And state licensing, for the most part, serves the purposes of taxation. So local TRLs, on the other hand, provide additional mechanisms to enforce state and local tobacco control laws. They help ensure retailers are complying with these laws and thus are more effective at reducing illegal sales and reducing tobacco use. They can also be used to implement policies that go beyond state law, such as restricting the sale of flavored products. So what would a local TRL look like? How would it help enforce laws regarding tobacco? So here are some basics about having a tobacco retailer license. They outline that selling tobacco is a privilege, not a right. The privilege to sell tobacco can be revoked if the retailer does not have a local license and must comply with its rules to maintain that license. So now that you have some context, let's get into the basic elements of a TRL. There are 5 basic elements: a license, a licensing fee, a connection between laws and the license, penalties for violating licensing rules, and look-back periods. So of course, a license is key to a comprehensive TRL. It's important that the license itself cannot be transferred between retailers and must be renewed annually. This way, all retailers maintain an understanding of laws pertaining to tobacco sales. And to ensure this, a fee should be incorporated to cover administrative and enforcement costs. The license should also be clear that if a retailer violates any tobacco control law, local or statewide, it is a violation of that license. So if a violation occurs, penalties need to be outlined. This can include increasing fines, but penalties like suspension or revoking of the tobacco retailer license incentivizes a retailer to ensure they do not repeat those violations. Significant penalties with look-back period have also been shown to be more effective in reducing youth sales than employee penalties or youth purchase and possession laws. And finally, adding a provision to look back on a retailer's past violation allows more serious penalties to be triggered if the retailer does continue to violate tobacco control laws. For example, if I was a retailer who sold to a minor for the 3rd time in 2 years, I may get a bigger fine or get my license revoked than if I was a retailer who had sold to a minor once in 3 years. So I'm going to pause now to remind everyone that if you have any questions so far, please don't hesitate to type them into the chat below. We will try to answer as many as we can at the end, and if not, then we can follow up via email. So a comprehensive TRL can feel very daunting to put together, but thankfully, ChangeLab has already gotten a great model to start with. So here's Jessica Breslin, staff attorney, who will tell us more about the ChangeLab Solutions TRL.
Great, thank you, Michelle. So we have recently updated our tobacco retail license model. It was updated last year. And some of the major changes, which I'll go through today, are there have been updated definitions for different things like tobacco products, which I'll go into more detail in a few slides. It also, in the past, we've had our model and then a separate document that had different plug-in policy options. As part of the new model, all of the plugins are already incorporated, so there wouldn't be a need to add additional language if you wanted to say, for example, also ban the sale of flavored products or one of the many plugins that we'll go through. And then we've changed the wording of some things to make sure that our model is aligned with state and federal law. And we've also removed youth purchase, use, and penalty, purchase, use, and possession penalties, and I will talk about that a little bit more later on as well. So the first major difference is there's been a change to the definition of tobacco products. So you definitely want to take a look at those if you're looking at our updated model. The new definition is written in a way to be more comprehensive so that it can capture the new products that are coming on the market without you having to continuously go back and update definitions in a local ordinance. For example, there's 2 products that have been submitted to the FDA that are being reviewed that are heat not burn products. So the definition is written in a way now that it would ideally capture any new products that are coming on the market, and not just the existing products that we know of, like cigarillos or traditional cigarettes or smokeless tobacco and things like that. And the first part of the model is basic retailer licensing, which Michelle covered a little bit of before, but generally the idea being that if you want to sell tobacco products, you have to obtain a license. Again, it's an annual license. There should generally be a fee involved to help cover administration and enforcement costs, and that license can't be transferred or sold. So if you have a retailer who decides to move their business, they can't sell the license to someone who's coming into that same spot. And then, but the main bulk of the model is that it incorporates all these different provisions that you can have for plugins. And we'll go through those now. And the plugins basically fall into 4 categories. They're either regulating place, which should be where tobacco can be sold. Price, there's a number of different pricing strategies you can have, such as minimum price or maximum pack size, because studies have found that youth in particular are very price sensitive, so these can have a very big effect on preventing youth use and sales to youth. There are some product plugins, so that would be things like flavored products and restricting the sale of them, and then there are some promotion plug-in policies that are in the model, which has to do with things like window signage and self-service displays and how tobacco products are promoted. And so we'll go through these different ones one by one. So the first is product, and that is you can use your tobacco retailer license to prohibit the sale of flavored products. Again, this should include all flavored products, including menthol. There is a carve-out exception for menthol in the federal law, but generally flavored cigarettes are banned by federal law, but there's a lot of room on the local level to expand on this and make sure that all flavored products, including electronic products, especially as we see the increase in youth using Juul and other electronic products. And it can be easier to put this as part of your TRL model as opposed to a standalone model because there's already enforcement mechanisms within a tobacco retailer licensing ordinance. You don't have to have additional enforcement mechanism that you would need if you were going to have a standalone flavor ordinance. We do also have a flavor model, which you can find on our website, and please feel free to reach out if you have more questions about choosing between doing that as part of a retailer license or a standalone model. And then our model also has a number of restrictions and policies related to price. And again, priority population communities and youth are particularly price sensitive, so this can be a very effective way to address use in these communities. So the first thing would be to specify a minimum pack size. So what that would look like, there's already a minimum pack size for cigarettes. As I'm sure you know, you have to buy cigarettes in packs of 20 or more. But this would allow cities and counties to establish a minimum pack size for other products. If you go to a local corner store or something like that, you may see that you can buy one little cigar for 50 cents, or maybe it says 3 little cigars for $1. This would be you could establish, I believe, in Contra Costa County, there is a 10 to 20 pack minimum for those types of products. So this would establish a minimum pack size for those products that would ideally make it more expensive because they're selling more at a time, and get rid of those cheap products that are very enticing to youth. Another option in our model is to prohibit the use of the redemption of discounts and coupons when purchasing tobacco products. So the tobacco industry spends millions of dollars every year sending out these elaborate coupons. For example, recently I somehow got on a Copenhagen mailing list, and I get these like incredibly thick and colorful coupons for Copenhagen in the mail every month. And so what the tobacco industry spends all this money issuing those to try and combat raises in prices through taxes or minimum price laws. And so one thing that you can do is to keep people from redeeming those coupons. So the company is still allowed to issue them, but if I were to go to the store and bring in my Copenhagen coupon, I wouldn't be able to use it at that store. I wouldn't be able to redeem it. And that again contributes to raising the price of products so that youth are less likely to buy them. And it can be a very important counter tactic to what the tobacco industry is trying to do. And the last one is to set a minimum floor price. So that would be that you can't charge less than a certain amount for different types of products. And it can be really important to pair this minimum floor price with the minimum pack size to make sure that you're not creating a market where there's just you can get a lot of tobacco products for cheap. So for example, in some jurisdictions, if we've seen only the minimum pack size passed but not the minimum price passed, then you might see something pop up where you can buy 20 little cigars for $1. But when these are paired together, so say for example, you can't sell a minimum or a pack of little cigars for less than $5, and there have to be at least 10 little cigars in there, then you're getting those two combined together will raise the price and make them less appealing to youth, and hopefully decrease tobacco sales. Another important thing, or what could be very important for your jurisdiction to think about when you're thinking about pricing policies, is sometimes it might be easier to get retailers on board with pricing policies because any increase in price goes back to the retailers as opposed to a tax where you might get complaints that money is going to the government. If you have a minimum price, all that money goes back to the retailers, so it might be a more attractive policy option if you're getting retailer pushback in your community. And next we can go through the different place options. There's quite a few that are already built into the model. And the idea around them being that you'd like to reduce the number of tobacco retailers. We also recently released a tobacco retailer density guide, which goes through in more depth all of these different strategies to reducing the number of retailers in your community. And this can be especially important when we're thinking about equity issues. because there's a number of studies have shown that tobacco retailers can cluster in certain communities, and then you have more exposure to products in those communities. So, for example, if I'm a kid who I walk to school every day and I'm walking by 5 tobacco retailers instead of 1 in a few blocks, there's a lot more exposure to the advertisements, there's a lot more exposure to those products, and then I'm going to become more likely to initiate tobacco use and keep using tobacco products because I've had additional exposure. So density and place, when we're thinking about who can sell tobacco and where can they sell it, can be really important when we're thinking about addressing health equity and the disparities in the tobacco outcomes that we've seen throughout California. So there are a number of ways that you can reduce the number of tobacco retailers. So you can make it part of your TRL policy that there can only be a certain number of retailers within a certain community. So for example, I could say if I'm the city of Oakland, I'd say we won't have more than 75 retailers. And you can just have a hard cap on that, not have further requirements. That's one option that's already in our model. Or different communities have done it different ways. You can also determine the number of retailers by population size. So that would be something like I can only have one tobacco retailer per 2,500 people in this city. That's one way to do it. San Francisco, for example, has done it by city district. So that would mean you can only have this amount of retailers within that city district. And again, this goes to prevent clustering in certain areas, so you're not seeing all these tobacco retailers in certain neighborhoods, whereas if you walk through different other neighborhoods, you might not see any. So those are a few different ways and a few different strategies that are in our model that can help reduce the number of tobacco retailers. And another thing to think about is just having a TRL policy can be helpful in reducing the number of retailers you have. For example, I often hear stories, so if you think about having to pay the fee, and you think about these businesses where their main product is not tobacco products. You hear about a donut shop where they happen to also sell tobacco, and then you institute a TRL ordinance where they have to pay a fee, and then they sit and they think as a business owner, I'm not really making that much money off these tobacco products. I'd rather not pay the fee. So just by having a TRL policy, you might see a reduction in the number of retailers. But in addition to that, there are a number of policies within our model which can help reduce the number of retailers. And you have less retailers, less exposure, and ideally you'll see decreases in purchase and decrease in use of tobacco products. So that's another thing to think about. And then another option that is already in our model is to prohibit tobacco retailers near schools and other youth-populated areas. So what that provision looks like would be something like you could not have a tobacco retailer within 500 feet of a school, or we have another definition in our policy for youth-populated areas, which is written very broadly to capture things like playgrounds or libraries, other places that youth might hang out. And there's room in the policy for you to add different areas in case there's something that's more particular to your community that you think needs to be included. For example, maybe there's a lot of skateboard parks or something that you want to specifically insert. But again, this reduces youth exposure to products, tobacco products, and to advertisements when they're going to places that they're always going to go. And it has been shown to reduce the reduce youth initiation of tobacco products and reduce youth use of tobacco products. And that is already in our model as an option. Another provision that isn't included in our model is to prohibit the sale of tobacco products in pharmacies. In addition to the model, we also have an infographic on our website that you can check out that it just gives a really good visualization of why selling tobacco products in pharmacies is is not a great idea and doesn't lead to good health outcomes. If you're thinking about a pharmacy as somewhere that you're going to get better and to improve your health, and then right next to what is a medicine, you'll see tobacco products that can send the wrong message. There are some pharmacies that have already voluntarily done this, the biggest one being CVS. And one fact about the CVS, they have a lot of great data that's come out now that they've had the policy in place for a while. And the thing that I've found most fascinating was somewhere between 35 and 40% of people who only bought their tobacco products at CVS just stopped buying tobacco products. They didn't switch their purchases to other stores. There's a convenience factor that makes it so it makes it easier to quit. And if you think about, I'm trying to quit and I have just this less exposure to it, it makes it easier to be more successful in your cessation efforts. And different cities have also passed this. San Francisco passed no tobacco sales in pharmacies, and it can be a really effective policy to include in your TRL ordinance, and something to consider. And lastly, when thinking about PLACE, there's also in our model to prohibit tobacco retailers near cannabis retailers. So under state law, you cannot be both licensed as a tobacco retailer and a cannabis retailer. But in addition to that, you want to make sure that they are not clustering in the same neighborhoods for the same reason you don't want tobacco retailers clustering in the same neighborhoods. So there's a provision in the model that prohibits any license to be issued to a tobacco retailer that's within 500 feet of a cannabis retailer. And again, our model has these sample distances, but they can be adjusted based on what makes the most sense for your community. If you're in a rural community, maybe 500 feet isn't enough, and you need to make it further apart. So that's just one thing to think about too, is that our model is just sort of, it's a starting point, and you can tailor it, and we can help you tailor it to your community and what makes the most sense and what will be the most effective there. And then our last sort of group of policy plug-in provisions are promotion provisions, and that has to do with how you're allowing tobacco companies to promote their products, or how you're allowing retailers to promote their products. And there's a few different ways that you can go, you can address this. One way is to limit window signage in stores. It is important that if you're going to do this, it's not limited to just tobacco product window signage because of First Amendment concerns. It has to be a content-neutral restrictions, but you can reduce the portion of the window that can be used for any type of signage. And basically, if you're reducing, so let's say, for example, 30% of your window cannot be window signage or advertisements. So just by virtue of having less space to put up the advertisements, the retailer is going to have less space for tobacco advertisements. So this, again, it can really reduce exposure when you're thinking about kids who are walking by their 7-Eleven or whatever retailer is there. They're going to be seeing these advertisements less because there will be less advertisements in the window itself. And if you're being exposed to advertisements less frequently, then studies have shown that you will also be less likely to initiate tobacco use or to have any ongoing tobacco use. So this can be an important policy to include in your TRL ordinance. But again, if you are considering this, please make sure that you consult with us, because there are First Amendment concerns, and also it needs to be a content-neutral restriction. Another policy you could include, which is you could limit sales to adult-only stores. So what that looks like is when you're thinking about these stores, which their primary purpose is selling tobacco, where it's an age restricted. So you would have to show your ID in order to get inside, and it would be limited to people over 21, or there's that small exemption for active military where you only have to be 18. And we are, in addition to our TRL model, which is possible to include this provision as part of a TRL ordinance, we are also working on an adult-only stores model, which should be available later this year. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, please feel free to reach out to us with questions if this is something you're thinking about or something you're considering. And lastly, our different types of zoning restrictions. We sort of went through these already when thinking about place. But again, one of the reasons that the place requirements can be so important are because of the exposure to advertisements and just tobacco use in general. All of these are included in our model, but they can also be a part of zoning restrictions. So if you're working within a community where you're getting a lot of pushback about tobacco retailer licensing and there's not really the political will to do it, there may be an opportunity to pursue these types of restrictions through the zoning code, and those are a little bit different, but you can have what are called these conditional use permits for retailers where they have to follow certain laws and rules, and the idea being that you wouldn't want tobacco retailers in residential areas or near schools, and so that the zoning commission wouldn't issue a conditional use permit if a retailer is applying for one within a certain amount of distance of a school or a youth populated area. We definitely recommend, if it's an option, pursuing tobacco retailer licensing over zoning restrictions because of a number of reasons, the biggest ones being they're easier to enforce, and there's an annual component to it. So for example, as we covered earlier, if you're applying for a tobacco retailer license, you have to usually apply annually, and that includes looking back at whether you've had any past violations, whereas when you apply for a conditional use permit, you generally only apply once. And there's no annual fee, so there's no annual check to make sure you're following the rules, and on top of that, you're also not getting an annual fee to help fund the administration of the program or the enforcement of the program. But those are all different strategies in our model that you can use to address the promotion of tobacco products, which can be really important when you're thinking about youth use and youth initiation. And now we're going to talk a little bit about enforcing a tobacco retailer license ordinance. There's definitely a lot to consider when you're thinking about what makes the most sense for your community. And so here are some of just the overview about things you want to think about when you're thinking about developing or thinking through what your enforcement strategy is going to be if you're pursuing a tobacco retailer licensing ordinance. And some of those things that you want to be thinking about is who is your enforcement agency? You know, is it going to be local police? Is it going to be a local tobacco control office? Is it going to be the regular health and safety code inspector? So that's really something that you want to think about what makes the most sense for your community. And you have different options of that in our policy of what to put in, of who you can have be the enforcement mechanism. There's also, I believe the center has put out, or American Lung Association has put out the matrix of different communities in California. And one of those matrices which says which communities already have TRL ordinances in place. It also breaks down what agency that community has designated to be in charge of enforcement, and there you can, looking at the chart, you can see there's a wide range of options. And again, this will just depend on your community and what makes the most sense for where you are, but it's definitely something to think about when you're thinking about drafting one of these ordinances. You also want to think about what they're going to be enforcing, so that might depend on which plug-in policies make the most, like, you're able to pass in your community, and thinking through who will be the best person to enforce those policies. You also want to think about when you're going to be enforcing these policies. So Michelle talked a little bit about the look-back period, and I'm just going to go over that a little bit more. So we generally recommend a long look-back period of around, I believe, 3 years is in our model. And what that means is that when somebody violates one of the provisions of the tobacco retail licensing ordinance, you're also going to be looking back, for example, for 3 years to see if they've had past violations. And if they have, then generally the retailer would have a bigger fine, or if they've committed enough violations, maybe their license will be suspended, or if it's already been suspended and they continue to violate, then it may be permanently revoked, where that person is not allowed to, or that organization or company is not allowed to sell tobacco products anymore. So you want to think about how long is your look-back period, what makes the most sense, because this is a way to make sure that you're capturing problematic retailers. So if someone's repeatedly violating the law, that you're addressing that in a different way than somebody who's only done it once. Maybe it's an issue of poor training or something that's fixed easily. But if you have a retailer who's constantly selling to youth, they're constantly selling flavored products when they're not supposed to, the look-back period allows you to address that. And in addition to thinking about how long you're looking back, you also want to think about how often you're doing inspections, such as like a youth decoy inspection of a retailer. TRL policies are most effective when they have required regular inspections. So, for example, that would be something like we require that you do 3 inspections a year of every tobacco retailer. And that means, for example, if I'm creating a policy for Fireball, California, and there's 7 retailers, and we have to check those 7 retailers 3 times a year, and 3 times a year we're doing youth decoys. And with those regular checks, you're going to be more likely to figure out if some of your retailers are problematically selling and repeatedly making violations, and it just makes sure that if you're going to pass this law, it's also going to be enforced so that it can be the most effective. You also want to think about how you're enforcing it. So what does that look like for your community? Or is it going to be a monetary penalty, or are there going to be more meaningful penalties such as license suspension? Because typically when you have a license suspension, it definitely will get the attention of a retailer, because let's say, for example, that your license is suspended for 30 days to sell tobacco products. That means for those 30 days, that retailer has to take all of the tobacco products off their shelves, take down advertising, things like that. And so that's something that can really affect a retailer's bottom line, make them think about compliance with the law, or maybe how they're training their employees, whether they're providing proper training on local laws, and things like that. And lastly, really the most important consideration is thinking about equity, and really thinking about equitable enforcement of the laws. Who are these laws being enforced against? Are they being enforced equitably, and making sure that you're not exacerbating problems or making a problem worse with this law. And so one thing to really think about that, or the way that we've incorporated into our model, is that the penalties are on retailers and not the employee. The person thinking about the retailer, the owner of the shop, is the person who has the power to train his staff, his or her staff, to implement their own policies to make sure that illegal sales aren't happening. And so who are you putting the burden of enforcement of tobacco controls laws on? And all of our documents are written with equity at the forefront, and that includes our models, and something that we've been thinking through as we develop different types of enforcement and how to implement them in the models. And that's definitely something that you want to be thinking about as you develop your own policies, to make sure that we're really addressing disparate outcomes in tobacco control, and thinking about who these policies affect and who they can most help. And then if you're looking through our model in Section 15, I just wanted to go over the different alternative remedies of enforcement. So in addition to regular compliance monitoring with meaningful penalties, which is what we just sort of talked about, making sure that suspension and revocation for repeated violations are an option in your policy, there are a few different other alternative enforcement options that are in our model and that may make sense to include for your jurisdiction. So one of that is the model declares violations of the ordinance to be a nuisance. Many cities and counties already have a nuisance abatement process that's written in their municipal code and their city code, and that's usually a process to go through the government if there's someone who's committing a nuisance, and under our model policy, violating the TRL model or ordinance would be a nuisance. There's usually a system within the city government to address that nuisance, or it's called nuisance abatement. And so there's already a process that can be used through the city to address repeat offenders or people who are not following the TRL. And again, if you have questions about any of these, or if you want us to look at your existing city code and let you know whether this is already a part of it, the nuisance abatement, and what it might look like or how it might work in your community, we would be happy to do that. But that's just something I wanted to highlight that is part of our model. If you wanted to include it. Our model also includes civil action, and that would basically allow for a private citizen to file an action in court against a retailer who's violating these laws. So those are two different options in addition to what we recommend would be the regular compliance monitoring. Additional options for enforcement, and again, it could be any part of your TRL. So there's the basic parts like license, not selling to kids, or violating any state or federal tobacco laws. But it could also be if you included one of the additional provisions like restriction of sale of flavored products. This is another way to enforce those provisions. If, for example, especially the civil action, if you have private citizens who are getting frustrated with the lack of enforcement. I know that we get calls about that sometimes, usually related to smoke-free air, but this could be a problem as well. And I just wanted to highlight those are some other alternatives that are available in our model. And then we've covered this mostly, but a number of ways that TRL can actually make it easier to enforce tobacco laws is that they can provide a funding stream. So for a TRL, you have to come up with a fee. I'll cover it a little bit later, but we have a TRL fee calculator on our website that can help you figure out what is the right fee for your city or county. But the fee is paid annually, and it can be used to fund different things like just regular standard administration, like the issuing of a license and the printing of a license. But it also can be used for enforcement funding. So it could be used to fund part of a tobacco control police officer, or it can be used to help fund whatever agency you're going to designate that's in charge of doing inspections. And that's something that's different, which I highlighted a little earlier, than zoning laws. Is that their zoning and conditional use permits won't have the same steady funding stream. So that's one way that it can be pretty helpful to have a TRL and help you enforce these laws. Another thing is the required inspections. Usually, and especially it's written in our model, and it should definitely be in something that you're strongly considering if you're pursuing a TRL policy. But that you require a certain amount of inspections of every retailer every year, and this just helps to keep retailers accountable. You can have the strongest laws on the books, but if you don't enforce them or actually make sure people are following them, then you'd have to think about how effective can this really be if no one's making sure that somebody is actually following this law. And then it also gives you the option to designate different enforcement authority. So this, again, this can depend a lot on what makes the most sense for your community. Does it make sense to fund a partial police officer to help do youth decoys? Does it make sense to fund the local health department who's already doing some type of inspection? So that's another way, is you have someone that, not only do you have these laws, you have a specific agency or person in your county or in your city who's in charge of enforcing it and who's charged in making sure that people are actually following these laws so that they can be the most effective. And again, just some things to think about when you're thinking about enforcement, different challenges that come up, is you might have different competing priorities. Again, that's where the fee can come in helpful, because then you can set aside and designate a person who's in charge of this. But if you don't have that fee, then maybe you have a local health department that has a lot of different laws that they're trying to enforce, and different competing priorities about what to enforce first, what to put the most resources to. So that's something a fee can be helpful with. It's something you want to think through. You want to think through what resources do you have. For example, if you're considering some of the place requirements, like you can't have a retailer within 500 feet of another retailer, then you need to have the resources for a mapping system to make sure that you know where all the retailers are and whether they're located close to each other or not. Or, for example, with a school, you need to be able to map where are retailers, where are schools, what is the 500-foot radius where you're not allowed to have another retailer. So you want to be thinking through these policies and what resources will you need to effectively enforce them. And again, sometimes there's often going to be retailer resistance, retailers not wanting to pay the fee, and that's just, again, things that you want to think through, make sure you're doing retailer outreach, and really or thinking back to like the pricing policies, that maybe that's a talking point you can have with a retailer, because the pricing policy, all that money goes back to the retailer. So those are just some challenges that you may encounter and some things that you want to be thinking through. And again, there is a calculator on our website that can help you calculate the cost to implement and enforce a TRL policy. This page looks like this, but you should be able to get it just by searching on our website. And this sort of breaks down so that you can add different apartments. It gets very particular about what percentage of time you're going to need for this person, what does that cost. So that can really help you think through what fee makes sense if you're going to have a fee with your TRL for your policy. And this is also available on our website. It's an implementation checklist for TRL. It could be helpful when you're thinking through these policies and what does implementation look like, and what does what are all the things I have to do when I'm going through this process. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight that our policy does not include any youth purchase, use, and possession penalties. There are a number of reasons for that, the biggest being that it's been shown to be a pretty ineffective policy, and if you're thinking about where to concentrate our resources in coming up with the most effective tobacco control policies, we want to be using the most effective policies, and youth purchase, use, and possession penalties have not been shown to be effective, whereas having a TRL with regular compliance checks has been shown to be effective. We also don't support youth pup laws because it may exacerbate inequities when we're thinking about which youth are targeted by the police for intervention. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that there's been a disparate impact on youth of color, and that's something you want to think through with these types of penalties. And again, it's an expensive policy to enforce with little results, so it diverts the limited amount of enforcement resources into something that's ineffective when they could be going to something like enforcing a TRL that's been shown by research to be more effective. And we should have a fact sheet which discusses our rationale for not including youth purchase, use, and possession penalties in the data to support that. That should be coming out in the next couple of months, so keep an eye out for that. And now we'll go through the questions. If you have any, again, please remember to type them in the chat box if you have anything you want us to answer. The question I'm looking at says, what is an adequate starting licensing fee that is sustainable enough to allow for PD, which I'm assuming means police department, time to be designated towards compliance checks? Is there data to back up these numbers? Again, I would highly suggest taking a look at that calculator on our website. That is part of what it goes through. And it can include a person from the police department, whether you want that person to be 100% time or 50% time or 40% time, whatever is needed for them to do those compliance checks. There's space on there to input that, and then it's depending on how many retailers you have in your community. There's a lot of different variables about what makes the most sense. I don't have like a general number because, again, it's going to be very dependent on your community and how you want it to be enforced and what that looks like. So, you know, enforcement in San Francisco, where there's hundreds of retailers, looks very different than enforcement in Reading, which is a much smaller town. So it's really dependent on that. My understanding is there is data to back up the numbers in that calculator. I'm not sure about access to it. I would definitely recommend reaching out to us if you'd like more specific information about how that calculator was developed and the data to support it. And then I'll give you guys a little more time if you have any burning questions to type them in the chat. The next question we got was, does the model policy state if the youth tobacco prevention survey must be conducted? I don't think it does state that has to happen, but if you want to reach out to us about how you might craft a provision like that to be put in, please feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, I think that's a great question about how can rural communities overcome the pushback from pushing a TRL ordinance. I think it would really depend on the community. For example, we just had the rural flavor products training, and I was talking to someone from Shasta County who was talking about all the pushback they get to any kind of government interference because of people who are in support of the state of Jefferson. So I think, you know, that might be a community where you're a long way from being able to work towards a TRL ordinance, but there might be other, you know, there's some other rural communities. Fireball comes to mind, who have actually had a lot of success in passing these policies. So I think it will really be community specific and depend on the type of pushback that you're getting, because obviously there's different complaints about different components of a TRL ordinance. I think that the center has some great materials about different counter arguments. I would definitely recommend checking out their resources, and if you would like to contact us and sort of just talk through what type of pushback you're getting, and you know, what type of data or what type of infographic or what type of information can help you overcome that, we'd be happy to set up a call to do that, because I do think it can be pretty community specific and dependent on what type of pushback that you're getting. Oh, great. I'll give like 1 or 2 more minutes for people to type in questions if they have them. And if you think of a question later on, please feel free to reach out and ask it. You don't have to ask it in the next 1 to 2 minutes if it takes you a while to come up with it.
Okay, well, thank you for everyone who has typed in a question. Again, as Jessica mentioned, if you have any other questions that might come up later, feel free to email Jessica. Her email address is there on the screen, or feel free to check out the ChangeLab Solutions website if you, again, have any other questions that come up Thank you so much, Jessica, for presenting today. We also hope that everyone, if you will take the next minute or two to complete our webinar evaluation, it should pop up on your screen after the webinar ends. Thank you. Have a great day.